There's a very simple process that most of us follow when we no longer need a vehicle that we own. If it's still worth any money, we try to sell it. If it's not worth anything at all, we'll have it scrapped. It's a good system, and it works. Not everyone follows that common sense system, though. Sometimes vehicles get abandoned and forgotten, left floating on the water or discarded by the roadside like yesterday's garden. Even one-of-a-kind, highly valuable vehicles sometimes find themselves in that predicament. And here are the amazing stories of a few of them. Let's begin with the infamous Lady of the Lake, a wrecked, abandoned plane that sits mostly submerged in the icy wilderness of the North Pole region of Alaska. The poetic title is the nickname that's been given to an old WB-29 Superfortress, although you'd struggle to identify it from the small portion of the plane that's visible above the waterline. This weather reconnaissance aircraft was retired from active service in 1955. Prior to that, she was a recon craft that regularly flew over the North Pole. But once she was no longer fit for that purpose, she was deliberately stripped of all her important parts and sunk in a lake that belongs to Eielson Air Force Base, where she was used for open water extrication training for several years. Eventually, the wreck became too dangerous to be used even for that humble but important duty. A particularly warm spring a few years ago raised the water level to the point where it became impossible to reach her. So now she'll stay there until she falls apart completely. Soviet-era military equipment can be found all over the former USSR, but much of it is stored in a more respectful manner than the hulk of the Lund-class Ekranoplan MD160. The colossal sea monster is currently stranded in the Caspian Sea after a failed effort to tow it to an alternative location, and as of August 2020, it started taking on water. Unless something can be done to save it very soon, it's probably destined to be swept out and then sunk. Obviously, this wasn't the original plan for its disposal. Before the towing accident, it was on its way to a museum, where it was due to become the centerpiece of a grand exhibition. The Ekranoplan was in active service with the Russian Navy during the 1980s and 1990s, but spent over 25 years laid up at Kaspisk before it was decided it should go to a museum. No ground effect planes of this size are still in service today, making MD160 one of the very last of its kind. Ironically, the American CIA nicknamed the Lund-class Ekranoplan the Caspian Monster when it first became aware of its existence. So maybe it's right that it's ended up in the Caspian Sea after all. You're probably familiar with the concept of a barn find, which is the name given to either a car or a collection of cars that are found in an old disused barn or garage. Barn finds are relatively common, but school finds like this one from New York State, USA, are unheard of. The discovery was made by American photographer Bryant Neal as the urban explorer ventured into an old school building that had been closed by the 1980s. He didn't know the cars were there, and so the scene that was waiting to greet him was a huge shock. It's thought that a car workshop briefly operated on the site after the school closed, but it shut down after a very short time in operation because the owner became ill. He never came back for his car collection, which includes a Cadillac DeVille, a vintage Ford Mustang, and a Ford Model A hot rod from the 1930s. They're all in various states of disrepair and dereliction, but based on these pictures, it looks like at least some of them might be salvageable. Hopefully, a new home can be found for the vehicle soon. During the time of the Soviet Union, Belarus was where the USSR turned when it wanted military vehicles built. That's where you'll find the Minsk automobile plant, and it was that plant that came up with the MAZ-7904 as part of the top-secret Selena project. This colossal 140-ton, 12-wheeled vehicle was to act as a carrier for the RT-23 Stellit ICBM missile. The creation of such an enormous heavy-duty vehicle would never have happened were it not for the paranoia of the Cold War era. Only a single unit of the vehicle was ever built, although it became the framework for the later MAZ-7907. It was completed during the 1980s, but the top-secret nature of the project meant that its existence wasn't known outside of military circles until the 21st century. The MAZ 7904 was 130 feet long, 22 feet wide, and 12 feet tall. It underwent testing in 1983, after which it was sent to the Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan in 1984. Unfortunately, in Kazakhstan, it was found to be too heavy for the ground and difficult to control. The project was scrapped, and the vehicle was stashed away in a hangar inside the Baikonur Cosmodrome until it was finally scrapped in 2010. There might be no vehicle quite so classically American as the pickup truck, so it's going to hurt our American viewers to see this one in such a poor state. It's a Hudson Super 6 pickup that was built in 1947, and it looks every bit as old as it is. The car was spotted in the desert of New Mexico, where it's thought to have been standing unattended and exposed to the elements for at least a full year. Either the car or its owner, or perhaps both of them, have had a rough life. The body of the car is riddled with bullet holes, and the idea that it might have been involved in some kind of crime cannot be ignored. Only 2,100 units of this vehicle were ever built, and a fully intact one in good condition can sell for more than $150,000 on the open market. This one, lacking its engine and its radiator grille, isn't worth anything like that amount. That didn't stop someone from spending $5,000 on it when it turned up for sale on eBay, though. We can only hope it's now in the hands of someone who has the necessary skills to restore it. Where do abandoned buses go to die in Ireland? Well, apparently they go to this abandoned bus graveyard in Cork. There are literally hundreds of former public transport vehicles in this old yard, which is hidden away in the west of the city. Some of them are only a few years old, but others date back half a century or more. Many of them were once in the service in Ireland, but a handful come from elsewhere in the British Isles. There are also a few old fire trucks standing side by side with the buses for good measure. Quite why all of these buses have been dragged here and left to rot is unknown, but there are a whole lot of fleets of identical vehicles rusting away in the wasteland. It would surely make more sense to break them down and reclaim the scrap metal, but perhaps there's a grander purpose in mind for the buses that we're not aware of. Until someone comes and moves them all along or scraps them, they're likely to continue to be controversial among the local people. While some historic vehicle enthusiasts love coming to take a look around, most people think the yard is an eyesore. Finding a car as unusual as a Proton Perdana gathering dust in an abandoned car lot in the United Kingdom is a strange discovery. When you find out who the car belongs to, it only makes the story stranger. This vehicle is owned by Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the 95-year-old former Prime Minister of Malaysia. His car, with license plate number VK5231, is holed up in a disused building in Surrey, England. According to a spokesperson for the politician, the car was sent overseas to a company called Fraser Nash Research Limited for research and development. To be more specific, the president wanted to develop a hybrid car for Malaysia, and he wanted to use his own vehicle as a template. That was back in 2016. These images come from September 2020. It doesn't look to us like there's much in the way of research or development going on inside this building. The spokesperson went on to say that this car ought to have been returned by now, and the ex-president would like it back as soon as possible. Given that the building appears to be abandoned, we hope he isn't holding his breath on that front. Perhaps abandoned is the wrong word to use to describe the USS Oriskany. The 1950s aircraft carrier that was built by the United States Navy hasn't technically been abandoned. It's just that it will never sail anywhere again. The vessel was deliberately shot at, then sunk in the Gulf of Mexico in 2006, so it could begin a new life as an artificial reef. The 900-foot-long ship put up a good fight despite its age when the time came to send it below the surface. It took 500 pounds of plastic explosives to get the job done, and even then it didn't sink for almost an hour. The ship is notable for its service in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and even once had former U.S. presidential candidate John McCain as a crew member in the latter war. Sinking it this way wasn't cheap. It took $20 million as a project. It's all been done for a noble cause, though. It'll hopefully provide a home for marine life in the area for decades to come. A little earlier on, we took a look at a pickup truck that had been left standing in the New Mexico desert for a year. This abandoned Ferrari Testarossa has been exposed to the elements for a lot longer than that. It's understood to have spent a full 17 years baking in the heat of the sun in Puerto Rico. When you take that into account, we're surprised that it doesn't look a lot worse than this. The paintwork is flaking and bleached in places, but other than that, it looks pretty good. The car's believed to have been driven to its long-term resting place and then carefully parked on a steep incline before being abandoned for reasons unknown. A used Testarossa generally sells for something in the region of $100,000. Someone claiming to be the owner of this one told the photographer that he'd be willing to part with it for only $30,000, but the photographer didn't have that kind of money available. The leather's a little shabby, and the Ferrari will doubtlessly need some attention from a mechanic after being left for so long. But it would make a great restoration project for someone. We don't know for sure how many years this MAV Class 424 locomotive has been abandoned in Budapest, Hungary, but we're willing to bet it's a very long time. It's been there for long enough for someone to remove the tracks from underneath it, and the railway shed it's parked inside is falling to pieces. Just over 500 of these trains were built in Hungary, entering use all over Europe. None are believed to still be in service today, and there's sadly no chance of getting this broken down example up and running again. All of the useful parts have been cannibalized or otherwise stripped away. It's probably very telling that there's a more modern facility situated next door to the old yard, and nobody who works there has ever shown any interest in acquiring the old engine and trying to do anything with it. It's a massively heavy unit weighing more than 130 tons, so trying to do anything at all with it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it's easier to allow the plants that are growing through it to carry on until they take it apart naturally. There's no type of car that's classier than a limousine, and it's a general rule of thumb that older limousines are classier than new ones. Based on that, this 1924 Stanley Steemer 7-passenger limousine should be a very classy vehicle indeed, but it's going to take a lot of work to restore it to its former beauty. It turned up in March 2016 as a barn find in the USA, and by the looks of things, we'd have to say that it had been there for a long time. Steam-powered cars are very difficult to find, so the fact that this one still exists in a theoretically drivable condition is almost miraculous. The era of the steamer was already coming to an end by 1924, so this limo would have been one of the very last of a dying breed. According to the person who found it and persuaded the owner to list it for sale, this is a government-issue limousine that was made in the final year of production for Stanley Steamers and hasn't run since the 1970s. The boiler needs to be repaired, and extensive restoration work will have to be carried out on the interior. It's difficult work, but it isn't impossible, and the fact that the aluminum bodywork hasn't rusted is a nice bonus. You can't see the vessel formerly known as SS Aquarama anymore. She was scrapped in Turkey in 2007. That came at the end of a staggering period of 42 years floating around as an abandoned ship, doomed to change hands from one failed project to another for decades. She was launched during the Second World War as the SS Marine Star, where she served with distinction as a troop ship until the war ended. The military sold her in 1952 in a move that saw her become a passenger ship on the Great Lakes under the new Aquarama name. She was popular with visitors, but her running costs made her unprofitable, so she was sold again in 1962 to a Michigan-based company that wanted to use her as a replacement for the Milwaukee Clipper. What the company hadn't counted on was the fact that they'd need to spend $700,000 to dredge the local harbor to accommodate her, and they didn't have the cash. That led to her being moored and effectively abandoned until 1987, when she was bought again. This time by a company that wanted to turn her into a floating casino in Buffalo, New York. The owners had her brought to Buffalo, but were unable to obtain the necessary licenses to open their casino. Perhaps they should have looked into that first. There she stayed for another 20 years until she eventually went to meet her fate in Turkey. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.